The deed arrived on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by a courier who wouldn't meet my eyes. I should have known something was wrong when the envelope felt heavier than paper ought to feel, as if the weight of what it contained had somehow transferred to the physical document itself. My grandfather had been dead for 3 weeks, and I'd already made my peace with getting nothing from his estate. We hadn't spoken in 15 years. The property was 47 acres in the deepest part of the Virginia Appalachians, so far from any town that the nearest grocery store was a 2-hour drive on roads that barely deserved the name. The lawyer's letter that accompanied the deed was brief. My grandfather had left me the land, the cabin, and what he called his responsibilities. That word was underlined twice. I'd never even known he owned property there. The last time I'd seen him, I was 22 and stupid, full of college education, and ready to explain to him how the world really worked. He'd listened to my speeches about logic and reason, about how science had replaced superstition, and then he'd asked me to leave his house. Now, at 37, with a failing marriage behind me and a career in wildlife biology that had stalled out in middle management, I figured a cabin in the mountains might be exactly what I needed. The drive from Richmond took 8 hours. The GPS gave up somewhere around Staunton, and I had to rely on the hand-drawn map the lawyer had included. Each turn took me deeper into wilderness, the roads narrowing from 2 lanes to 1, from paved to gravel, from gravel to dirt. The trees pressed in on both sides, their October colors brilliant in the afternoon sun. But there was something about the way they leaned over the road that made me keep checking my mirrors. I found the cabin just before sunset. It sat in a clearing about 300 yards from where I had to leave my truck, connected by a path that looked recently maintained. The structure itself was older than I'd expected, built from logs that had darkened with age to nearly black. Smoke rose from the chimney. My first thought was squatters. My second thought was that someone had been taking care of the place. The porch was swept clean. Firewood was stacked neatly against the side wall, and there were fresh flowers in a mason jar on the windowsill. Purple asters, the kind that grew wild in these mountains. The front door was unlocked. Inside, the cabin was one large room with a loft, simple but clean. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace. On the kitchen table, centered like an offering, sat a still warm apple pie and a note in handwriting I didn't recognize. The note said, "Keep the contract. They have been patient, but patience ends." I set it aside, figuring it was meant for my grandfather, some local arrangement I'd need to sort out. The pie smelled incredible, cinnamon and nutmeg, and I realized I hadn't eaten since breakfast. I cut myself a large slice and explored the cabin while I ate. Everything was basic, but well maintained. Cast iron pans, oil lamps, a hand pump for water. No electricity, which didn't surprise me this far out. In the loft, I found my grandfather's bed, neatly made with a quilt that looked handmade. Beside it, on a simple wooden nightstand, was another note. This one was in my grandfather's cramped handwriting. "If you're reading this, then you didn't listen when I tried to warn you all those years ago. Or maybe you did listen, and you came anyway. Either way, the land is yours now, and so are the obligations that come with it. Check the root cellar. Maintain the offerings. Do not, under any circumstances, let them go hungry. They have been patient for 70 years. That patience is not infinite." I read it 3 times, each reading making less sense than the last. The old man had clearly lost it near the end. Offerings, patience. It sounded like the kind of backwoods superstition I'd spent my entire academic career learning to see past. The root cellar was accessed through a trapdoor in the kitchen floor. I grabbed one of the oil lamps and descended the wooden ladder into darkness that seemed to swallow the light. The temperature dropped 20 degrees, and my breath came out in visible puffs. The cellar was larger than I'd expected, carved from the bedrock itself. Along one wall were shelves of preserved foods, jars of vegetables and fruits, smoked meats wrapped in cheesecloth. normal root cellar contents. But the far wall was different. There was a schedule painted directly onto the stone in white paint, columns and rows, like a spreadsheet. Dates running down the left side, starting from 1952. Next to each date was a quantity and type of food. 20 pounds of meat, 40 pounds of grain, 50 pounds of fruits and vegetables. The measurements were precise, obsessive. The last entry was dated 3 days ago, 3 days after my grandfather's death, and someone had checked it off. Beside the schedule, wooden crates were stacked, each labelled with contents and dates. I opened one. It was full of fresh apples, though the label said they'd been stored 2 weeks ago. They should have been starting to soft, but they looked just picked. A sound from above made me freeze. Footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate. The boards creaked under considerable weight. I waited, holding my breath, the lamp trembling slightly in my hand. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice, then stopped at the front door. The door didn't open. Instead, I heard a sound I'd never heard before and will never forget. It started as a low rumble, so deep I felt it in my chest more than heard it with my ears. Then it rose, becoming something between a howl and a scream, but neither of those words do it justice. It was a sound that spoke to something prehistoric in my brain, something that knew to fear it before my conscious mind could even process what I was hearing. The lamp went out. I stood in absolute darkness, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it. The sound came again, closer now, right above me. The floorboards creaked, dust drifting down through the cracks. Whatever was up there was massive. Then, clear as day, I heard it speak. Not in English, not in any language I recognized, but the meaning was somehow clear in my mind. It was a question, and the question was, where? I knew, without understanding how I knew, that it was asking about the offerings. My hands shook as I felt my way to the crates of food. I grabbed what I could carry, apples spilling from my arms, and made my way up the ladder. The main room was empty, the front door still closed. But through the window, I could see a shape in the darkness, massive and upright, waiting just beyond the tree line. I did the only thing that made sense in that moment of pure instinct. I opened the door, set the food on the porch, and backed away. The shape didn't move for a long moment. Then it emerged from the shadows, and my understanding of the world shattered like a dropped mirror. It stood at least 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb the moonlight. Its face was almost human, but wrong in every proportion, the brow too heavy, the jaw too strong. Its eyes caught the light from the cabin's fire and reflected it back yellow-green. Arms hung past its knees, ending in hands that could have palmed a basketball, but moved with deliberate, almost delicate precision as it gathered the food. It looked at me once, a long, evaluating stare that made me understand I was being judged. Then it turned and walked back into the forest, each footstep vibrating through the ground. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in a chair facing the door, a kitchen knife in my lap, trying to reconcile what I'd seen with everything I thought I knew about the world. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it had been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and the strange atmosphere of the place. Black bears could stand upright. In bad light, with fear distorting perception, a bear could look like almost anything. I spent the next day exploring the property, partly to familiarize myself with the land, and partly to prove to myself that what I'd seen had a rational explanation. I found deer trails, evidence of raccoons and possums, even black bear scat near a wild apple tree. Normal forest life, nothing out of the ordinary. But I also found other things. There was a cleared area about a half-mile from the cabin where the trees had been bent and woven together to form a shelter. The construction was deliberate, branches twisted in ways that would have required tremendous strength. Inside, the ground was covered with a bed of dried grass, fresh enough that it still smelled sweet. The ceiling was high enough that I could stand upright with room to spare. Near a creek that ran through the eastern portion of the property, I found prints in the mud. They were humanoid in shape, but wrong in every other way. 16 inches long, 7 inches wide, with 5 toes that spread in a way that suggested incredible flexibility. The depth of the impressions indicated something that weighed at least 400 pounds. I took photos with my phone, but they came out blurry, the autofocus refusing to lock onto the shapes. That evening, I returned to the cabin to find another pie on the table, still warm. This time, I was certain I'd locked the door. The windows were all intact, no other way in or out. The pie sat there like a challenge to my sanity. I checked the root cellar schedule. Tomorrow was a feeding day. 30 pounds of meat, 50 pounds of produce. The quantities seemed impossible, enough to feed a large family for a week. I thought about leaving, getting in my truck and driving back to Richmond, letting the property rot. But something kept me there. Maybe it was curiosity, the scientist in me needing to understand. Maybe it was pride, not wanting to be driven off by fear. Or maybe it was the memory of that creature's eyes, intelligent and evaluating, seeing me in a way that suggested I was the one being studied. I drove to the nearest town the next morning, a place called Millbrook, that was barely more than a general store and a gas station. The store was run by an old woman named Ruth, who looked at me with recognition the moment I walked in. "You're the Marsh boy," she said. It wasn't a question. "My grandfather was James Marsh," I confirmed. She nodded slowly. "We wondered if you'd come. Your grandfather said you might, though he hoped you wouldn't." "Did you know him well?" "Well enough. He kept to himself mostly, but he came in regular for supplies." She paused, studying me. "You staying at the cabin?" "For now." "Then you'll be needing the usual order." She turned and began pulling items from shelves without asking what I wanted. Canned goods, fresh meat wrapped in butcher paper, sacks of grain, boxes of produce. The pile grew until I was sure it wouldn't fit in my truck. "This is too much," I said. "It's what your grandfather always got. Every week, regular as clockwork." She began tallying the cost on an old adding machine. Course, he never said what he did with it all. Man lived alone, ate like a bird when he did come to town for a meal. But every week, same order. Did he ever mention why he needed so much food? Ruth's fingers paused on the keys. "Your grandfather understood some things are better left unasked. The mountain has its ways, always has. Smart folks don't question them." I loaded the supplies and drove back, her words sitting heavy in my mind. The mountain has its ways. It was the kind of thing people said in places like this, where civilization was more of a suggestion than a reality. But there was something in the way she'd said it, a weight that suggested more than superstition. That night, I followed the schedule. I laid out the food on the porch as indicated, meat separated from produce, everything arranged in neat rows. Then I sat inside, lights out, watching through the window. They came just after midnight. Not one, but 3. 2 adults and what looked like a juvenile, though even the young one was taller than me. They moved with a coordination that suggested long practice, one keeping watch while the others gathered food. The largest, which I assumed was male by the broader shoulders and heavier build, stood at least 9 feet. The other adult was smaller, but still massive, maybe 7.5 feet, with movements that seemed more graceful, almost feminine. The juvenile was the most fascinating. It showed clear curiosity about the cabin, approaching the windows while the adults were busy. When it saw me watching, instead of fleeing, it tilted its head and raised one hand in what looked almost like a wave. I found myself waving back before I could think better of it. The adult female made a soft huffing sound, and the juvenile immediately returned to her side. They finished gathering the food into woven grass bags I hadn't noticed them bring, then melted back into the forest. The entire encounter had taken less than 10 minutes. I stayed at the window for another hour, processing what I'd seen. A family group, tool use in the form of bags, social structure with clear parental supervision, communication between individuals. Every checkbox for intelligence was being ticked, but my mind still rebelled against the implications. The next morning, I found something on the porch, a small pile of mushrooms, the kind that grew deep in the forest and were prized by foragers. Morels, worth $30 a pound in Richmond restaurants. They'd been carefully cleaned and arranged on a broad oak leaf. A gift, payment, or just coincidence? I spent the day going through my grandfather's things more carefully. In a trunk in the loft, I found his journals, decades of them. The early entries were mundane, notes about weather and daily tasks. But starting in 1952, they changed. September 15th, 1952, found tracks by the creek. Not bear, not human, something else. September 22nd, 1952, saw it at dawn. God help me, I saw it. 8 feet tall, covered in hair, watching me from the ridge. When our eyes met, it didn't run, just turned and walked away, like it had decided I wasn't a threat. October 3rd, 1952. It came to the cabin last night, took the deer I'd shot but hadn't yet processed, left mushrooms in exchange. There's intelligence there, reasoning, trade. The entries continued, documenting a gradual establishment of what my grandfather called the compact. He would provide food on a schedule, and they would leave him in peace. More than that, they would protect his land from other dangers. He wrote about finding a poacher's trap destroyed, the metal twisted beyond what any man could do, about a rabid coyote found dead near the cabin, its neck broken cleanly, about storms that devastated the surrounding area but left his clearing untouched. By the 1960s, the relationship had evolved. He wrote about brief encounters, moments of what he called mutual acknowledgement. One entry stood out, June 4th, 1967. The female brought her young one to the edge of the clearing today. It couldn't have been more than a few years old, walking unsteady but curious about everything. She let it watch me work in the garden for almost an hour. Trust. That's what this is becoming. God knows what would happen if others knew. They'd come with guns and cages, destroy everything. The secret has to be kept. I read through decades of entries, watching my grandfather's understanding evolve. He never gave them a name, always referring to them as they or the family. He documented their habits, their seasonal movements, their growth. The juvenile from the 60s grew to adulthood, eventually bringing its own mate and offspring. Generations of creatures living alongside one human who kept their secret. The final entry was dated a week before his death. October 1st. They know I'm dying. Don't ask me how, but they know. The young one, 3rd generation now, came closer to the cabin than ever before. We looked at each other for a long time. Understanding passed between us. I've left the land to Michael. He's the only family I have left, and despite our differences, he has the right kind of mind. Scientific, but not closed. Skeptical, but not cynical. He'll need both. The compact must continue. They've been patient for so long, but that patience was for me, not for my species. If the offerings stop, if the compact breaks, I don't know what will happen. I should have told him years ago, but how do you tell someone this? How do you make them believe? Maybe it's better he discovers it himself. Maybe that's the only way to really understand. They're not what we'd call human, but they're people. That's what 70 years has taught me. They're people, and they deserve to exist. I set the journal down and walked outside. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and red. Somewhere out there, a family of impossible creatures was living lives parallel to, but separate from humanity. My grandfather had been their guardian, their secret keeper, their bridge to a world that would destroy them if it knew they existed. The weight of that responsibility settled on my shoulders, like a physical thing. That night, I didn't hide in the cabin. I sat on the porch when they came, visible in the moonlight. The adult male stopped when he saw me, his massive frame tensing. We looked at each other for a long moment. Then I did something that surprised both of us. I spoke. "I'm James's grandson," I said slowly, clearly. "I'll honor the compact." The creature tilted its head, processing. Then it made a sound, a low rumble that seemed almost like acknowledgement. The female and juvenile emerged from the shadows. The young one started to approach, but the female made a soft vocalization that stopped it. They gathered the food and left, but the interaction felt different. Less transactional, more personal. Over the next week, I established a routine. I maintained the schedule, drove to town for supplies, explored the property during the day. I found more evidence of their presence, structures and tools, marking posts that seemed to define territory. I also found older signs, things that suggested they'd been here far longer than my grandfather's 70 years. Rock formations that looked deliberately stacked, trees bent into shapes that had to be centuries old to have grown that way. Ruth at the general store began to warm to me, sharing stories about my grandfather, how he'd helped people in town without asking for anything in return, how he'd known things, like when storms were coming, or when someone was lost in the woods. She never directly mentioned the creatures, but her stories all had gaps, places where something was deliberately left unsaid. "Your grandfather was a bridge," she said one day as she rang up my supplies, "between what folks around here know and what they admit to knowing. You understand?" I nodded, beginning to grasp the wider network of silence that protected these creatures. It wasn't just my grandfather keeping a secret. It was an entire community choosing not to see, not to speak, not to endanger something that had been here longer than any of them. The breakthrough came 2 weeks into my stay. I was sitting by the creek, trying to photograph some of the prints in better light, when I heard movement behind me. I turned slowly, no sudden movements, and found the juvenile watching me from about 20 feet away. In daylight, I could see details I'd missed before. Its eyes were brown, not the yellow-green I'd seen in reflected light. Its face, while heavy-browed and primitive by human standards, showed clear intelligence and curiosity. The hair covering its body wasn't uniform. It was shorter on the face and hands, longer on the back and shoulders, with patterns that seemed deliberate rather than random. I stayed still, letting it decide what would happen next. It approached slowly, cautiously, until it was close enough that I could smell it. Not unpleasant, just different. Earthy, like dried leaves and pine needles, with something musky underneath. It pointed at my camera, then at the prints in the mud, then back at the camera. The gesture was clear. It understood what I was doing. "You want to see?" I asked, feeling slightly ridiculous talking to it, but unable to help myself. I turned the camera's screen toward it, showing the failed photos I'd taken. The creature leaned in, fascinated. Its breathing was deep and regular, and this close, I could hear its heartbeat, slower than human normal but steady. Then it did something that changed everything. It reached out and gently took the camera from my hands. Its fingers were thick but dexterous, handling the device carefully. It looked through the viewfinder, pressed the button, took a photo of me. Then it handed the camera back and made a sound that I swear was laughter, a huffing, chuckling noise that was unmistakably amused. I looked at the photo. It was perfectly framed, in focus, well composed. The creature had understood the technology immediately and used it correctly. "You're playing with me," I said, and got another huffing laugh in response. The adult female's call ended the encounter. The juvenile turned and ran back into the forest, moving with a speed and grace that made me understand how easily they could avoid human detection when they wanted to. I sat by the creek for another hour, trying to process what had just happened. Not just intelligence, but humor, playfulness, theory of mind sophisticated enough to understand photography and its purpose. That evening, I left paper and charcoal on the porch along with the food. The next morning, the charcoal was gone, but there was a design drawn in the dirt near the porch. It showed 3 figures of different sizes, standing next to a smaller figure near a square that probably represented the cabin, a family portrait. I began leaving different items each night. Simple tools, which were examined and sometimes taken, sometimes left with modifications that improved them. Fabric, which disappeared entirely. Books, which were looked at but always returned, sometimes with dirt smudges on pages with pictures. The real test came when I left a children's xylophone, the kind with colored bars and 2 mallets. I watched from the window as the juvenile discovered it. The adult seemed wary, but the young one was entranced. It hit the bars randomly at first, then began to notice the different tones. Within minutes, it was playing simple patterns, repeating sequences, experimenting with rhythm. The adult male watched for a while, then gently took one of the mallets and showed the juvenile a different pattern. They passed the mallets back and forth, creating increasingly complex rhythms, clearly enjoying the interaction. It was music, primitive but intentional, and it was beautiful. I thought about my grandfather's journals, his decades of silent observation. He'd known all of this, witnessed their intelligence, their family bonds, their culture, and he'd kept it secret, understanding that revelation would mean destruction. A month into my stay, something changed. I woke one night to the sound of wood knocking, rhythmic and urgent. Not the usual gentle sounds I'd grown accustomed to, but sharp, aggressive cracks that echoed through the forest. The pattern repeated 3 times, then silence. I looked out the window, but saw nothing. The next morning, the food I'd left was untouched. More concerning, there were new prints around the cabin, different from the family I'd been interacting with. Larger, deeper, with a longer stride. Another individual or group had come through. That evening, the family arrived earlier than usual. The adult male circled the cabin repeatedly, clearly agitated. He made low vocalizations to the female, who kept the juvenile close. They took the food quickly and retreated, but not before the male locked eyes with me and made a gesture I interpreted as a warning. He pointed to the forest, then to me, then made a cutting motion across his throat. The message was clear. Danger. Stay inside. I spent the next 3 days in the cabin, venturing out only to refresh the food offerings. The family didn't come. On the 3rd night, I heard sounds in the distance that made my blood cold. Screaming, not quite human, but close enough to trigger every evolutionary alarm in my body. Fighting, the crack of breaking wood, the thunder of massive bodies colliding. On the 4th morning, the adult male returned alone. He was injured, a gash across his shoulder that bled dark against his hair. He took only a small portion of food, then did something unprecedented. He approached the cabin and knocked on the door. Not aggressively, but deliberately, the way a person would. I opened the door, my heart pounding. He stood there, massive and powerful, even wounded, and extended his hand. In his palm was a stone, smooth and flat, with a symbol carved into it that looked like interlocking circles. I took the stone, and he pointed to himself, then to the forest, then held up 3 fingers. 3 days. He was telling me he'd be gone for 3 days. Then he pointed at me and made a gesture that clearly meant, stay here, stay safe. I nodded understanding, and he turned and left, moving with purpose despite his injury. Those were the longest 3 days of my life. I heard nothing, saw nothing. The forest felt empty, abandoned. I maintained the offerings, even though no one came for them. I studied the stone he'd given me, wondering at its significance. The carving was old, worn smooth in places, suggesting it had been handled frequently over many years. On the morning of the 4th day, they returned. All 3 of them, plus 2 others I hadn't seen before, An elderly female, grey-streaked and moving slowly, but with unmistakable authority. And another juvenile, smaller than the first, clearly younger. They approached the cabin as a group, stopping just at the edge of the porch. The elderly female came forward, moving with the careful dignity of age. She looked at me for a long moment, then reached out and touched the stone I'd hung around my neck on a piece of cord. She made a complex series of sounds, almost like language, though I couldn't understand the words. But her tone was clear. Gratitude, acceptance, welcome. She gestured to the others, and they all came forward, closer than they'd ever been. The adult male's shoulder was healing, already starting to scar. Whatever they were, they healed faster than humans. He made eye contact and nodded, a gesture so human it was startling. The female huffed softly and pushed the first juvenile forward. It approached and placed something on the porch. A small figure woven from grass and twigs, roughly humanoid in shape. A doll, or perhaps a totem. The smaller juvenile, emboldened by the first, came forward with its own gift. A perfectly round stone with veins of quartz running through it, polished to a shine. I understood this was a ceremony of sorts, an acceptance. I was no longer just maintaining my grandfather's compact. I was being brought into something older, deeper. "Thank you," I said, picking up both gifts carefully, respectfully. "I'll protect them. I'll protect you." The elderly female made that huffing laugh sound, then reached out and patted my shoulder with surprising gentleness. Her hand engulfed my entire shoulder, but the touch was careful, almost maternal. Then she turned and led the group back into the forest, but not before the first juvenile gave me that wave again, which I returned. That night, I dreamed of ancient forests and paths between trees that led to places maps didn't show. I dreamed of generations of creatures living in the shadows of humanity, adapting, surviving, maintaining their own culture and families despite the encroachment of a world that would deny their existence. When I woke, I understood my grandfather's final words about patience. It wasn't just about the food. It was about waiting for humanity to be ready to share the world. And until then, people like my grandfather, like me now, would stand as bridges between two worlds that occupied the same space, but rarely touched. I began documenting everything, but not in the way my scientific training had taught me. No photos that could be leaked, no physical evidence that could be stolen. Just words, carefully coded, and drawings that suggested rather than revealed. A record that could guide, but not expose. Weeks turned into months. I extended my leave from work, then quit altogether when they demanded I return. My ex-wife called once, concerned about my radio silence, but I couldn't explain why I needed to stay. How could I tell her about the juvenile that now came to the cabin regularly, that was learning to communicate through gestures and sounds? How could I describe the elderly female teaching the youngsters which plants were medicine and which were poison? Knowledge that would die with her if not passed on. Winter came early that year. By November, snow was falling steadily, and I worried about the family. Would they migrate? Hibernate? But they adapted, their hair growing thicker, their movements changing to accommodate the snow. They showed me their winter shelters, elaborate structures built into the hillsides and insulated with materials that would have challenged human engineers. The juvenile, which I'd started thinking of as young one in my head, began visiting daily. It would sit just off the porch while I read aloud from books, seeming to enjoy the sound of human voice, even if the words meant nothing. When I started teaching it simple words, pointing to objects and naming them, it learned with frightening speed. "Tree," I'd say, pointing. "Tree," it would attempt, the word distorted by vocal cords never meant for human speech, but recognizable. "Rock." "Rah, rock." Within a month, it had a vocabulary of maybe 50 words, mostly nouns but some simple verbs. More importantly, it was teaching me in return. Their language was complex, tonal, with sounds that human throats couldn't quite reproduce. But I learned their words for danger, food, family, home. The adult male, who I'd come to think of as guardian, began showing me the boundaries of their territory. We would walk together, him leading, me following, as he showed me marker trees, scent posts, and places where others of their kind had passed through. I learned to read the forest the way they did, to see the signs that had always been there, but that human eyes typically missed. There were others, I learned. Not many, but some. Family groups scattered throughout the deep mountains, each with their own territory, their own arrangements with the few humans who knew. The elderly female, who I called Elder, would sometimes draw in the dirt, showing me rough maps of where others lived. The distances were vast, territories separated by highways and towns that made travel dangerous. One map she drew made my heart sink. It showed their territories shrinking, pushed back by development, logging, and human expansion. What had once been connected forests were now islands, isolated and vulnerable. She pointed to several areas and made a cutting gesture. Gone. Those families were gone. The implications were clear. They were dying out, slowly but inevitably. Each generation was smaller than the last, with fewer opportunities to find mates outside their immediate family group. The genetic bottleneck was real and tightening. That's when I made the decision that changed everything. I had money saved, enough to live carefully for years. My grandfather's cabin was paid for, no mortgage, minimal taxes. I began researching the surrounding properties, finding out who owned what, which parcels were for sale. There were 3 adjoining properties, a total of 200 acres, that connected my grandfather's land to a larger wilderness area. It took 6 months to arrange the purchases without arousing suspicion. I created a conservation trust, all legal and above board, dedicated to preserving old-growth Appalachian forest. Nobody questioned it. City people buying mountain land for conservation was common enough. With the expanded territory, I could support more than just the one family. I reached out carefully to the network my grandfather had been part of, the silent guardians who knew the truth. Most were suspicious of an outsider, but the stone the guardian had given me was a token of acceptance that opened doors. There were 2 other families within 50 miles, both struggling. One was down to just a mated pair, elderly and childless. The other was a female with 2 juveniles, her mate killed by a logging truck while crossing a road at night. I offered them sanctuary, a place where territories could overlap safely, where genetic diversity might have a chance. The negotiations took months and happened entirely through intermediaries, the creatures themselves. Elder served as an ambassador of sorts, traveling despite her age to meet with the others. The juveniles went with her, learning the process, understanding that their survival might depend on cooperation rather than isolation. The first new family arrived in spring, the elderly pair moving slowly but with dignity. They were different from my family, lighter in color, with subtle differences in build and feature that suggested significant genetic variation. Guardian was initially tense, but Elder managed the introduction with careful ritual. Territories were established, overlapping but distinct, with the cabin as neutral ground. The female with juveniles came a month later. She was wary, frightened, but her children were bold. They integrated quickly with young one and the smaller juvenile, forming a cohort that played and learned together. By my second summer on the mountain, I was managing a small population of 13 individuals. The logistics were staggering. Food requirements alone were nearly £1,000 a week. I hired locals to help, people who knew how to keep secrets, paying them well for their silence and labor. Ruth from the general store became an ally, ordering supplies in quantities that would have raised eyebrows if spread across multiple vendors. She never asked directly, but she knew. Once she said, "Your grandfather would be proud. What you're doing, it matters." The creatures began to thrive. With more genetic diversity, more territory, and consistent resources, they could focus on more than just survival. I watched them develop what could only be called culture. Music became a regular evening activity, using drums made from hollow logs and the xylophone I'd provided. They created art, weaving complex patterns from vines and grasses, arranging stones in meaningful designs. Young one's language skills developed rapidly, and it became our primary translator. We developed a pidgin of sorts, mixing their language with English, creating something both species could use. Through this, I learned their own name for themselves, which translated roughly to first people or old people, depending on context. They knew their history, passed down in oral tradition. They had been here before humans, had watched the first Native Americans arrive, had seen the Europeans come. They had tried coexistence, but it always ended badly. So they had chosen the shadows, the spaces between, visible only to those who could be trusted. One night, Elder drew me a picture in the dirt. It showed the continent, roughly but recognizably, with dots scattered across it. Each dot, she indicated, was a group like theirs. There were maybe 40 dots, some with X marks through them. Gone, extinct. The remaining dots were few and far between. "How many individuals total?" I asked young one, who translated. Elder thought for a moment, then held up her hands, showing 10 fingers, 8 times. 80. Maybe 80 individuals of their species left in all of North America. The weight of that number sat on my chest like a stone. A species on the brink, invisible to science, protected only by the silence of a few dozen humans who understood the cost of revelation. That fall, something extraordinary happened. The female with juveniles, who I'd started calling Haven, was pregnant. It was the first pregnancy in the combined group in years, and the excitement was palpable. Everyone contributed to preparing a shelter for her, bringing the softest materials, the best food. Guardian turned out to be a skilled midwife of sorts, having assisted with births before. When Haven went into labor in December, during a heavy snowfall, the entire group gathered nearby, offering support through vocalizations that sounded like singing. The birth took 14 hours. I stayed in the cabin, but I could hear everything, the sounds carrying through the still winter air. When the baby finally arrived, its first cry was the most human sound I'd ever heard them make, indistinguishable from any human newborn's wail. They brought the infant to show me the next day, tiny by their standards, but still the size of a 6-month-old human baby. It was covered in fine, dark hair, except for its face, which was wrinkled and perfect. Its eyes, when they opened, were blue. Elder indicated this was normal, that they would darken with age. The baby represented hope, but also pressure. One birth against the tide of extinction wasn't enough, but it was a start. Winter passed slowly. I spent it improving the infrastructure, building feeding stations throughout the territory so the creatures didn't have to venture near human areas. I installed motion-activated cameras that fed to a closed system with no internet connection, allowing me to monitor for intruders or danger. Young one's language skills had developed to the point where we could have real conversations. It asked me questions about human society, about cities, about technology. I tried to explain cars and planes, computers and phones, but the concepts were so foreign that we often ended up laughing at the inadequacy of translation. In return, young one told me about their worldview. They saw the forest as a living entity, not in a mystical sense, but in a practical one. Everything was connected, each action rippling through the ecosystem. They had names for phenomena that science was only beginning to understand, like the way trees communicated through fungal networks, or how certain birds' migration patterns predicted weather changes. They had religion of sorts, though it was more philosophy than faith. They believed in the continuity of life force, that death was transformation rather than ending. They honored their dead, by returning them to the forest, laying them in special places where decomposition would enrich the soil. They showed me one such place, a grove where the trees grew taller and stronger, fed by generations of their dead. Spring brought challenges. Hikers began appearing on trails that skirted the territory. The creatures were expert at avoiding detection, but the stress was visible. They spent more time in the deep woods, visiting the cabin less frequently. Haven kept her baby hidden, terrified of human discovery. I instituted new protocols. I hired a couple of local kids to maintain false trails that led hikers away from sensitive areas. I posted signs about dangerous conditions, unstable ground, anything to discourage exploration. I spread rumors in town about aggressive bears, mountain lions, even rabies outbreaks. Anything to keep people away. It worked mostly. But in May, we had a close call. A group of college students, drunk and bold, decided to camp illegally on the property. They were less than 100 yards from one of the shelter sites. I found them first, playing the role of angry landowner, threatening them with prosecution if they didn't leave immediately. As they packed up, one of them said he'd heard weird sounds in the night, like talking, but not quite human. His friends laughed at him, but I saw him scanning the tree line, looking for something he couldn't quite define. After they left, Guardian appeared beside me, having been watching the entire time. He put his massive hand on my shoulder, a gesture of gratitude and trust. Then he did something he'd never done before. He spoke a single English word, heavily accented, but clear. Friend. That summer was the best time. The baby thrived, growing at an astounding rate. By 6 months, it was walking, climbing, exploring with endless curiosity. The group had stabilized into a functioning community, sharing resources, cooperating in child rearing, developing their own small society. Young one had become fluent enough in our pidgin language to serve as a teacher for the others. Soon, several of them could communicate basic concepts. Names emerged, or rather, the names they called themselves became pronounceable to me. Guardian was actually something like Stonewatcher. Elder was Memory Keeper. Haven was Night Singer. They began to trust me with more of their knowledge. Memory Keeper showed me medicinal plants, demonstrating uses that human herbalists had never discovered. Stonewatcher taught me to read weather patterns in the behavior of insects, to predict storms days in advance. Night Singer shared their music, complex rhythms that told stories of their history. I documented everything in code, filling journals as my grandfather had. But I also began to plan for a future without me. I was 40 now, with perhaps 40 more years if I was lucky. What would happen to them when I was gone? The answer came from an unexpected source. In August, a young woman appeared at my door. She was maybe 25, with the kind of quiet intensity that suggested she'd seen things that had changed her. She introduced herself as Sarah Chen, Ruth's granddaughter from the general store. "My grandmother says you need help," she said simply. I was immediately suspicious, but she pulled out a small carved stone from her pocket, identical to the one Stonewatcher had given me. Her grandfather, she explained, had been part of the network before he died. He'd known about them, had helped protect them. She'd grown up on the stories, thinking they were fairy tales, until her grandmother told her the truth. "Why now?" I asked. "Because Gran's getting old, and someone needs to learn the supply chains, because you can't do this alone forever, and because they deserve to survive." I spent a week verifying her story, checking with the network. Everything checked out. More importantly, when I brought her to meet the group, Memory Keeper recognized her. Her grandfather had been the one who helped my grandfather establish the first compact, back in 1952. Sarah proved invaluable. She was studying ecology at Virginia Tech, bringing scientific knowledge that complemented my wildlife biology background. She helped establish better feeding programs, designed to provide maximum nutrition with minimum human food dependency. She taught them about native plants they could cultivate hidden in the forest, expanding their food sources. More importantly, she brought new ideas about long-term survival. She'd been studying genetic bottlenecks in endangered species, understanding what was needed for a population to recover. The math was daunting. They needed at least 50 breeding individuals to avoid immediate extinction, 500 for long-term survival. We had 13. But Sarah had connections through her university, carefully feeling out professors who might be sympathetic without being dangerous. She found 2 more groups, one in West Virginia, one in Kentucky, both struggling but surviving. Communication was established, carefully, slowly, through the network of human guardians. Plans began to form for corridors between territories, ways for the groups to meet and mix genetics without exposing themselves to human detection. It would take years, maybe decades, but it was hope. Fall arrived with unusual heat, the kind of extended summer that climate change was making more common. The creatures struggled with the temperature, their heavy coats adapted for cooler weather. We set up cooling stations, pools of water and shaded areas with ventilation. It helped, but I could see the concern in their eyes. Their world was changing faster than they could adapt. Young one, now nearly adult-sized, asked me a question that haunted me. Will we survive? I couldn't lie to it. I don't know, but we'll do everything we can to help. It nodded, understanding uncertainty. Humans won't stop, will they? Taking forest, making hot, building roads. Some humans are trying to stop it, I said, knowing how inadequate that sounded. Not enough humans, young one replied, and I had no argument against that truth. That winter, 2 more families arrived, refugees from a territory that had been clear-cut for development. They were traumatized, having barely escaped the machines that destroyed their homes. One of them, an adult male, had a cough that wouldn't go away, likely from inhaling diesel fumes during their flight. We were now at 23 individuals, the largest gathering of their kind in living memory. The logistics were becoming impossible to hide. Food deliveries were noticed, questions were asked. I had to expand the network, bringing in more humans, each one a potential breach of security. But something beautiful was happening too. The creatures were recovering their culture. With more individuals, they could maintain traditions that had been impossible with only family groups. They held ceremonies for the full moon, gathering to vocalize in harmonies that carried for miles. They taught the young ones skills that had almost been lost, like the crafting of specific tools and the reading of subtle forest signs. A master storyteller emerged from one of the new groups, an ancient female who could recreate their oral histories in such detail that even I, understanding only fragments, was mesmerized. She told of the time before humans, when their kind numbered in the thousands and ranged from ice to jungle. She told of first contact with humans, the initial curiosity, the attempts at trade and communication, and then the fear, the hunting, the long retreat into shadow. Through young one's translation, I learned of times they had saved human children lost in the forest, only to be hunted by the parents who couldn't accept what had saved their offspring. I learned of peaceful meetings with indigenous peoples who knew them as neighbors and respected the boundaries. I learned of the wars between their own kind, territory disputes that became less about land and more about the right to exist at all. Spring came with news that changed everything. Sarah's carefully placed inquiries had reached the wrong person. A cryptozoologist at her university, someone who'd spent his life trying to prove the existence of Sasquatch, had noticed her interest in specific ecological patterns. He'd followed her, carefully, professionally, and he'd seen just enough. He approached her with an offer. He wouldn't expose anything if he could just observe, just document for his own research. He swore secrecy, promised to never publish without permission. He seemed sincere, even sympathetic. Sarah brought the problem to me, and I brought it to the group. The council, as they'd begun organizing themselves, discussed for 3 days. Through young one, They asked detailed questions about this man, his history, his motivations. Finally, Memory Keeper made the decision. They would meet him once and then decide. The meeting was arranged for a neutral location, a deep valley where escape routes were plentiful. The cryptozoologist, Dr. Marcus Webb, was everything you'd expect, bearded, intense, carrying notebooks filled with decades of research. But he was also respectful, keeping his distance, making no sudden movements. Stonewatcher approached him first, stopping about 10 feet away. They looked at each other for a long moment. Then Webb did something unexpected. He sat down on the ground, making himself smaller, less threatening. He pulled out a notebook, and instead of writing, he drew. A simple sketch of Stonewatcher, quick but skilled. He turned the notebook around, showing the drawing. Then he set the notebook and pencil on the ground and backed away. Stonewatcher approached, picked up the notebook, and studied the drawing. Then, with movements that seemed impossible for such large hands, he drew his own picture, a human figure, roughly sketched, but recognizable as Webb. It was the beginning of an exchange that lasted hours. No words, just images, each side trying to communicate through art. By the end, Webb was crying, overwhelmed by the reality of what he'd spent his life seeking, and the creatures had made another careful alliance. Webb proved valuable in unexpected ways. His academic connections gave us access to genetic research without exposing samples to scrutiny. He helped design breeding programs that maximized genetic diversity. He brought in medical knowledge that helped with the respiratory problems some of them had developed from pollution exposure. But he also brought danger. His sudden disinterest in public Bigfoot research was noticed by his colleagues. His frequent absences were questioned. We had to create elaborate covers, fake research projects to explain his behavior. That summer, the baby, now a toddler by their standards, spoke its first words, not in their language, which it had been vocalizing for months, but in English. "Hello, friend," it said to me, the words carefully formed. The significance was profound. This child was growing up bilingual, bicultural in a sense, equally comfortable with its own kind, and with the few humans it knew. It represented a possible future where the species didn't just survive, but adapted to coexistence. But that future was threatened constantly. Development continued to press against the territory boundaries. Climate change altered the forest in subtle but significant ways. Disease, brought by human contact, no matter how careful we were, took 2 of the elderly that winter. We buried them in their sacred grove, following their traditions. The entire group gathered, vocalizing in harmonies that seemed to pull grief from the air itself. Even I cried. These beings I'd known for such a short time, but who had changed my entire understanding of the world. Young one, now fully adult and taking a leadership role, came to me after the ceremony. In our shared language, it said, "We need to leave." "Leave? Where would you go?" "North, Canada, more forest, fewer humans, some of us anyway." It was logical. The territory here, even expanded, could only support so many. The young adults needed their own territories, space to start families. But the journey would be dangerous, crossing roads, towns, avoiding the million ways humans could detect and destroy them. Plans began immediately. Webb used his connections to identify potential territories, places remote enough to be safe, but accessible enough to maintain the support network. Sarah researched corridors, finding the safest routes north. I coordinated with the network, setting up safe houses, supply caches, people who could help without asking questions. The group that would leave consisted of 6 individuals, young one among them. The preparation took months, teaching them about the specific dangers they'd face, the human patterns they'd need to avoid. We equipped them with emergency supplies, medicine, and most importantly, contact information for trusted humans along the route. The night before they left, the entire community gathered. Stories were told, memories shared, promises made to stay in contact through the network. Young one and I sat apart for a while, this being who I'd watched grow from curious juvenile to capable adult. "Will you come back?" I asked. "Someday, when safe, when more of us, maybe." "I'll miss you." Young one made their laughing sound. "Miss you too, teacher. You gave us hope." "You gave me purpose," I replied, and meant it. They left at dawn, moving through the forest like shadows, there and then gone. Those of us who remained watched until even the trees that had moved in their passing had stilled. Then we returned to the work of keeping the rest alive. That was 3 years ago. Young one's group made it to Canada, establishing a territory in British Columbia with the help of local First Nations people who had their own traditions of protection. They've had 2 babies since, the population slowly growing. Here in Virginia, we maintain 15 individuals. The baby is now 4, as curious as young one ever was, but with the advantage of growing up in relative safety. It speaks 3 languages, the old people's tongue, English, and a smattering of Spanish from a new family that arrived from Mexico last year, refugees from cartel violence that had pushed into their mountain territories. Sarah has taken over much of the daily management, bringing in new technologies that help without exposing, drones that scout for threats, sensors that detect approaching humans, even a rudimentary internet system that lets the creatures see the wider world without entering it. Webb publishes papers about theoretical populations, always careful to keep them abstract, building a scientific framework for protection without providing proof of existence. He's established a fund, supposedly for general cryptid research, that actually funnels money to the network of guardians. And I continue my grandfather's work, now understanding that it was never really about me or him. We're just links in a chain stretching back to the first humans who chose protection over exploitation, who saw personhood in different forms, who kept the secret because some truths are too dangerous for the world to know. The creatures, the old people, the first people, whatever name fits, they know their situation. They understand extinction, possibly better than we humans do despite causing it. They've watched hundreds of species disappear, including others like themselves. They harbor no illusions about their future, but they also embody hope. Every birth, every successful relocation, every young one that learns to navigate both worlds is a small victory against the inevitable. They've adapted before, survived ice ages and warming periods, the arrival of humans and the destruction of their world. They might survive this too, if we can give them enough time, enough space, enough silence. Last week, I received a message through the network. A group in Alaska, previously thought extinct, had made contact. 12 individuals, including 3 pregnant females. They needed help establishing a feeding program before winter. Sarah's already making arrangements, and Webb's working on secure transportation for supplies. The old people now number approximately 130 across North America, up from 80 when I first learned the truth. It's still critically low, but the trend is finally upward. The genetic diversity programs are working. The territories are stabilizing. The next generation, raised with human allies from birth, might have a chance. I'm 57 now. My knees remind me daily that I'm not made for mountain living. Sarah's brought in 2 more young people to train, ensuring continuity when I can't do this anymore. I've updated my will, leaving the land to the Conservation Trust in perpetuity, with Sarah as director. Sometimes on quiet evenings, Memory Keeper sits with me on the porch. We don't talk. She doesn't have the vocal cords for human speech, and at 90-something years by our best estimate, she's too old to learn new languages. But we communicate anyway, in the silence of shared understanding, in the weight of responsibility passed between species. She won't live much longer, and when she goes, thousands of years of memory will go with her. But she's been teaching the young ones, passing on what can be passed on. The stories change in the telling, adapting to new realities, but the core remains. They are the old people. They were here first. They will endure. I think about my grandfather often, about the choice he made in 1952 to feed rather than fear, to protect rather than profit. One man's decision rippling through decades, maybe centuries. He couldn't have known where it would lead, couldn't have imagined his skeptical grandson would become the guardian of an entire species' survival. But that's the thing about the compact, the arrangement, the bridge between worlds. It's not grand or glorious. It's daily work, small choices, keeping secrets that want to be shouted. It's looking into eyes that aren't quite human, but are definitely people, and promising that their children will have a future. The world isn't ready to know they exist. Maybe it never will be. But in the hidden places, the spaces between what we know and what we believe impossible, life continues. Families grow, cultures evolve, and two species that should be enemies become something like friends, something like family, something like hope. Tonight's a feeding night. I can hear them approaching now, their footsteps careful but familiar. Stone watchers' heavy tread, night singers' lighter step, the chaotic energy of the children. In a moment, I'll go out and help distribute the food, maybe share some words with those who've learned them, maybe just stand in comfortable silence with those who haven't. Tomorrow, Sarah's bringing a doctor she trusts to look at one of the juveniles who's been coughing. Webb's coming next week with new genetic data that might help us identify breeding matches. The network reported a possible new group in Montana, survivors from a forest fire who need immediate aid. The work continues, the secret holds, the compact endures, and somewhere in British Columbia, young one is probably teaching its own offspring about the time when the world was larger, when their people were many, and about the strange, hairless apes who became their unlikely saviors, one meal, one kindness, one generation at a time. I never expected my life to take this turn. I was supposed to be a wildlife biologist, studying known species, publishing papers, contributing to established science. Instead, I'm the keeper of impossible creatures, the guardian of living myths, the bridge between worlds that can't acknowledge each other, but can't survive alone. My grandfather was right. I had the right kind of mind for this, skeptical enough to question everything, open enough to accept the impossible when faced with proof. But more than that, I had the right kind of heart, willing to sacrifice a normal life for something extraordinary, willing to keep a secret that burns to be told, willing to love beings that the world would destroy if it knew they existed. The moon is rising, full and bright. In its light, I can see them clearly, these impossible, incredible, irreplaceable people. They're my responsibility now, my family in all the ways that matter, and I'll protect them until my last breath, as my grandfather did, as Sarah will after me, as someone will after her, because that's what you do for family. You feed them, you shelter them, you keep their secrets, and you never ever let them go hungry. The old people are survivors. They've outlasted ice and fire, flood and drought, and they'll outlast humanity if given the chance. All they need is time and space, and the silence of those who know the truth. All they need is people like us, the keepers of the compact, the guardians at the bridge, the ones who choose protection over proof, who choose love over glory, who choose them over everything the world could offer for their exposure. It's not an easy choice. It's lonely and difficult and sometimes terrifying. But when I see the baby, now 4 years old, playing with absolute joy in the moonlight, when I see the young adults courting with shy gestures and gentle sounds, when I see Memory Keeper teaching the little ones which stars to follow when the world changes, I know it's the only choice. They are not us, but they are people, and people deserve to survive. The feeding is done. They're dispersing back into the forest, back to their shelters and families and lives lived in shadow. But tomorrow they'll return, and the next day, and the next. As long as there are people like us willing to maintain the compact, they'll survive. My grandfather's note was right. They have been patient. But that patience was earned through decades of trust, through small acts of kindness, through the simple recognition that the world is big enough for all of us if we can just learn to share it. I'm going inside now. The fire needs tending, and I have journals to update, supplies to order, plans to make. The work of preservation never ends. But sometimes, like tonight, I stop and stand in the doorway, looking out at the forest that holds such impossibilities, and I feel the weight of privilege. I know something the world doesn't. I've seen something most people couldn't imagine. I've been trusted with a secret that could change everything, and I've chosen to keep it, to nurture it, to protect it with my life, because some things are more important than being believed. Some truths are too precious for the world, and some families are bound by more than blood, more than species, more than anything science could classify or explain. The old people will survive, not because they're strong, though they are, not because they're smart, though they are that too, but because a few humans chose to see them not as monsters or myths, but as neighbors, as relatives, as people deserving of dignity and space and time. That choice, made again and again by people like my grandfather, like me, like Sarah and Webb and all the others in the network, that choice is what stands between them and extinction. It's a heavy responsibility. It's also the greatest honor of my life. The moon is high now, the forest alive with normal sounds, crickets and owls and the rustle of small things in the undergrowth. But if you listen carefully, if you know what to hear, there are other sounds. The low rumble of contentment as a parent settles a child to sleep. The soft huffing of laughter as juveniles play. The complex vocalizations of adults planning tomorrow's activities. The sounds of people living their lives, hidden but whole, endangered but enduring, impossible but absolutely, undeniably real. The old people are out there. They're surviving. And as long as there are those of us willing to keep the compact, they'll continue to survive. One day at a time, one generation at a time, one secret at a time. That's my grandfather's legacy. That's my purpose now. That's the promise I make every night when I look at the stars and know that other eyes, not quite human, but definitely aware, are looking at the same stars and wondering if tomorrow will be better than today. For them, I'll make sure it is. For as long as I can, in whatever way I can, I'll make sure it is. The compact endures, the bridge holds, the old people survive, and somewhere in the darkness, a child who speaks 3 languages is dreaming of a future where hiding isn't necessary, where different kinds of people can share the world openly, where the compact becomes a conversation and the bridge becomes a door. It's an impossible dream. But then again, they're impossible too, and yet they exist. Maybe impossible is just another word for not yet. Maybe someday the world will be ready for the truth. Until then, we keep the secret, maintain the compact, and protect the impossible, incredible, irreplaceable old people who share our world in the shadows. That's the real inheritance my grandfather left me. Not the land, not the cabin, but the responsibility and the privilege of standing between 2 worlds, keeping both safe from each other until they're ready to meet. I don't know if that day will come in my lifetime. Probably not. But every small victory, every birth, every successful relocation, every young one that grows to adulthood brings that day closer. Until then, I'll be here, in this cabin in the Appalachian wilderness, feeding the old people, keeping their secrets, and knowing that I'm part of something ancient and essential and absolutely worth every sacrifice it demands.